I know I'm several months late with this, but back in July of this year, Nature published the DNA results for an ancient Egyptian individual, specifically from the Old Kingdom. This particular individual, NUE001, was from Nuwayrat, which is located in Upper Egypt. These results show that the admixture of the Nuwayrat individual was made up of two different sources, a Neolithic North African component and a Mesopotamian component. Roughly 77% of this individual's ancestry came from a population that was most closely related to the Middle Neolithic Moroccan peoples known as the Skirat Ruazi, and the other 23% came from a Neolithic Mesopotamian population. While these results are fascinating, they are hardly surprising to anyone who knows anything about the archaeology and history of pre-dynastic and pharaonic Egypt. Egypt has always been culturally and demographically influenced by other Near Eastern cultures, especially Mesopotamia. Could this new DNA evidence lead to an updated version of the dynastic race theory? I am going to answer this question and give my broader analysis of the results. As the paper published by Nature states, roughly 3/4 of the ancestry most closely matches the Neolithic Maghrebi Skirat Ruazi. This does not mean that pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom Egyptians are descended from Neolithic Moroccans. Rather that Neolithic North Africans share very recent common ancestry. In other words, the Neolithic Egyptian split from other Neolithic North Africans was more recent. The other aspect that is important with regards to this component is that 76% of the Skirat Ruazi group's ancestry is Levantine. This ancestral component was likely the result of Levantine pastoralists entering into Neolithic Morocco and wider North Africa, where they introduced Southwest Asian domestic animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle. The remaining 24% of the Skirat Ruazi ancestry is derived from the previous Tafarat peoples, whose genetic makeup is 60% Natufian-like and 40% ancient North African. Interestingly enough, there was another Neolithic Moroccan group known as the Kaftat El-Gar, whose ancestry is mostly Neolithic European. This likely resulted from Neolithic Europeans migrating into the Maghreb and introducing farming via demic diffusion. This is corroborated by archaeological evidence, which shows that Neolithic Europeans made contact with North Africa and introduced the obsidian trade. The genetic evidence from the Skirat Ruazi and Kaftat El-Gar shows that there was substantial Eurasian back migration through North Africa around 5000 BCE, as has been shown by previous Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA studies on North Africans. The Skirat Ruazi-like ancestry in the Old Kingdom Nuwayrat individual would also have been a two-way combination of Levantine and Tafarat ancestry. The paper even includes a graph that shows the distal ancestry of this Old Kingdom Egyptian individual, with roughly 68% being Neolithic Levantine and 17 to 18% being Epipaleolithic Moroccan. This means the majority of the Nuwayrat individual's ancestry was West Eurasian, which is not surprising when one looks at Egypt's location and the artwork of the Old Kingdom. The archaeological record of Neolithic Lower Egypt also confirms this, with the sites of Madi and Buto showing many similarities to southern Levantine sites such as Beersheba. Arguably, the most important archaeological evidence that corroborates these DNA results is the Neolithic package being introduced from the Levant. This package includes domestic crops such as wheat and barley, along with domestic animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle. It is clear that this Old Kingdom individual would be closely related to Neolithic North Africans, and by extension have a substantial amount of Levantine ancestry. But to me, the most interesting component of this individual's genome is the Neolithic Mesopotamian component. The amount of Mesopotamian ancestry in this Old Kingdom individual is clearly non-trivial, which indicates there was substantial migration from the Fertile Crescent. If one looks at the distal ancestry of this component, it is from the Zagros Mountains. For context, Zagros hunter-gatherers were one of the main ancestral components that contributed to the ancient Near East, along with the Natufians, and to a minor degree, Anatolian farmers. Now, how do we know this is specifically Mesopotamian ancestry and not some other Neolithic West Asian source? For a comparison, the paper also includes admixture models for other samples from around the same time period as the Old Kingdom Nuwayrat individual. One of the samples is from the early Bronze Age city-state of Ebla in northern Syria. Roughly 40% of this sample's admixture comes from the Neolithic Mesopotamian source that is also found in the Old Kingdom sample, which makes sense since Ebla was clearly culturally influenced by the Sumerians and was conquered by the Akkadians. since this component is found in Ebla, a Syrian city-state clearly within the Mesopotamian sphere of influence. It is likely from Neolithic Mesopotamia. An argument could be made that the Neolithic Mesopotamian component was introduced via the Levant pastoralists or farmers that migrated into North Africa and contributed to the Moroccan Neolithic and Nuwayrat ancestries. The issue with this is that some of the other Bronze Age Levantine samples, specifically from Hatzor and Tel Shaddud in Israel, do not have this Neolithic Mesopotamian component. Their ancestry is a mix of Levantine Chalcolithic and Zagros Neolithic. A counter to this point could be that maybe the Zagros component in these Bronze Age Levantine samples is just a proxy for the Neolithic Mesopotamian component. While this is a strong argument, this study addresses this by using an F4 statistic to determine which is the best source for the Nuwayrat individual's deviation from the Moroccan Neolithic group, and Mesopotamian Neolithic was determined to be the best source. And if we look at the distal ancestries of these samples, the Zagros component decreases to less than 10% in the Bronze Age Levant, while it is still roughly 15% in Old Kingdom Egypt. As stated before, the majority of the distal ancestry for the Old Kingdom Nuwayrat individual is Levantine Neolithic, so the model is able to distinguish between the Levantine and Zagrosian or Mesopotamian ancestry. Also, the Neolithic Moroccan samples, which have over 70% Levant Neolithic, do not have any Zagros ancestry. Another problem with the hypothesis that the Mesopotamian ancestry entered into Egypt via Levantine farmers or pastoralists is the archaeological record shows evidence of strong Mesopotamian influence in Upper Egypt during the Naqada II period, but not in Lower Egypt. To me, this indicates that there was direct contact between Mesopotamia, specifically Sumer, and Upper Egypt, with the Sumerians likely sailing up the Red Sea. The Mesopotamian cultural influence was introduced into Egypt via demic diffusion, as has been confirmed by the DNA evidence. Staying on the topic of Mesopotamian ancestry found in the Old Kingdom Nuwayrat individual, this is another instance of genetics confirming what Near Eastern archaeologists already knew. While the dynastic race theory no longer has mainstream support among Egyptologists, the Mesopotamian influence on pre-dynastic Egypt is undeniable. And with the DNA evidence confirming that Mesopotamian influence was introduced via Sumerian migration into Egypt, perhaps a modern, updated version of the dynastic race theory will become mainstream within Egyptology and archaeology. Perhaps Egyptologists and archaeologists just needed undeniable evidence that Mesopotamians migrated into Egypt, but the archaeological and demographic evidence was always there. Archaeological evidence of Mesopotamian influence on Egypt include the recessed niches within temples, cylinder seals, mace heads, artistic motifs such as the tamer of the beasts, and pottery. Specifically, with the pottery, it was manufactured in Egypt with Egyptian clay, but clearly copies Sumerian-style pottery. This indicates the Egyptians knew how to make Sumerian-style pottery, specifically from Uruk, and that there were Sumerian traders living in Egypt. Other goods appear in Naqada II era Egypt, such as lapis lazuli, which would have been transported from Afghanistan to Iran, then to Mesopotamia. Then the Mesopotamians would have traded them directly in Egypt. Mesopotamians also likely introduced the idea of writing into Egypt, and the ziggurat shows influence on early Egyptian pyramids. As Donald Redford pointed out in his book, Egypt, Canaan, and Israel in Ancient Times, the Mesopotamian cultural influence on Egypt reached such an intensity that mere trade cannot explain it. There was also a big population increase during this time in Egypt, and the genetic and archaeological evidence shows this was caused by migration from both the Levant and Mesopotamia. I am not arguing that a group of invading Sumerians conquered Egypt and became the ruling class of early dynastic Egypt, imposing civilization on them. I am arguing the evidence shows that Mesopotamians were significant contributors, both culturally and genetically, to the cocktail that was pre-dynastic Egypt. The DNA results from this Old Kingdom individual now provides conclusive evidence of this Mesopotamian contribution. Hopefully, more samples are published in the future which can shed even more light on the genetic history of Egypt.